you, Your Honor. May it please the court, defense counsel, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, good afternoon. In the early morning hours of April 4th, 2018, Deputy Ledbetter is on the Ocean Breeze golf course. It's an abandoned golf course. And he's there with his canine dog, Tucker. And they're there to search and see if they can find any odor of human remains. You'll hear about how Tucker goes over to a shallow sand pit that has been recently covered, and he starts to paw. And when he does, he's alerting that there are human remains inside that pit. The police uncover what's underneath, and it absolutely shocks their senses. It is gruesome, it is despicable. What is inside that shallow pit are 2 garbage bags. Both have blue drawstrings. One of them has duct tape wrapped around it. In one of the garbage bags is the upper torso of a human being with the head cut off, decapitated. Both arms have also been cut off, and it is sawed halfway through, and there are organs inside. In the other bag, which is a little bit more open, there's the bottom half of the torso, from the waist down to the legs, with the bottom legs cut off as well. And it is in a state of decomposition. It has been there for a little while, and it smells, and you're going to hear about that smell. Ladies and gentlemen, the state's evidence will show you that the defendant in this case, James Scandirito Sr, is responsible for the murder and abuse of the human body of his own father. DNA confirms that those body parts belonged to James Skip, also known as Skip, Scandirito. You're going to hear a lot about him. You're going to hear about how he is an extremely active person. He plays racquetball, he plays tennis. He's a creature of habit and routine. He lets his cats out at the same time. He always takes his garbage out on time. That's how he lived his life. He was a widower. He was a widower. And you're going to hear about how we lead up to this gruesome discovery. Because to understand how and why the defendant committed this crime, we have to go back to the week prior. So that was April 4th. When we go back, March 27th, it's a Tuesday, you're going to hear from Gary Gooden, and he's going to tell you that he's lifelong friends with Skip. He has plans to come down to Florida to stay with Skip, and him and the defendant and Skip, the 3 of them, have a plan that coming Saturday, they're going to watch the Final Four basketball tournament together. They're all big Michigan State fans, and they want to watch the Final Four basketball game. And so Gary goes to the other side of the state and plans on coming back that Saturday. That's the last phone conversation that Gary ever has with Skip Scandirito, his friend. March 28th, it's a Wednesday. You'll hear that the defendant and his dad go and play a round of golf at the South Winds Golf Course in Delray. Normal day for Skip. He goes to Costco. You'll see video of that. He fills up his gas tank. Later on in the day, around 8:30 p.m. that night, the defendant and his father are together. They're together inside Skip's home in Boca Raton, Florida, and Skip makes a phone call. He makes a phone call to his friend, Betty Butcher. It's a longtime friend of his. They've known each other for about 5 years. And he calls her because the next morning at 7 in the morning, the 2 of them are supposed to go to the Miami Open. They're going to play tennis. Like I said, Skip was very active. They're going to watch the tennis match. They love tennis. She has a conversation with him around 8:30 at night. He tells her that he's got the waters all planned out. He's got towels ready to go. He's packed. He's ready. He's excited. And she can hear the defendant in the background. And the 2 of them appear to be having an okay time. Skip sounds like maybe he's been drinking a little bit, but he's in good spirits. That is the last known telephone contact with Skip Scandirito alive. The evidence will show that on that day, the defendant logged into his Bank of America account 6 times. And that night at 9:30, when he logged into his Bank of America account, he had a total of $3.40 in his bank account. Early morning hours of March 29th, you'll see and hear about the strange things that start happening. You'll see evidence of the defendant's vehicle going in and out of his dad's neighborhood, early morning hours, around 2 in the morning. And then you'll see that Skip's car, which is a Ford Escape SUV, it's a white SUV, also leaves. And when it does, it leaves at 5:40 in the morning. And then there's the defendant at Home Depot at 6 o'clock in the morning, one of the first people there. And he walks inside and he purchases a gas can, a hand truck, like a red dolly. He pays in cash. And later on that morning, he sends a text from Skip's phone abruptly canceling the Miami Open for Betty Butcher. Something completely out of character for him. And this starts the timeline when Skip Scandirito's routines are completely broken. He's not letting out his cats. He's not taking out the trash, and people are starting to take notice. He's not answering phone calls or going straight to voicemail. You're going to see surveillance of the defendant and his movements, how he starts traveling down to Fort Lauderdale all day, back and forth, into his garage, into his apartment with duffel bags, golf clubs, plastic bags. And about 4 p.m., you'll see surveillance video of the defendant buying cleaning supplies. He buys cleaning supplies at a Publix near his dad's house in Boca Raton, and he's using his dad's credit card. And what he buys is pine saw, a tile scrubber, and cigarettes and beer. Hour and a half later, it's not enough. He comes back to the same Publix with his dad's credit card, buys a Pro Scrub mop, he buys duct tapes, he buys a hefty bag with blue strings and paper towels. Those are the things that he buys. Later on that night, there's a transfer from his dad's bank account into his own of $1,400. And at this point, ladies and gentlemen, the police, nobody knows where Skip is, but they're not looking. They don't know that anything's wrong yet. March 30th is a Friday. Afternoon time, the defendant is seen in the Ford Escape at Walgreens buying more cigarettes on his dad's credit card. But remember, Gary Gooden's supposed to be coming the next day. So through the state's evidence, you'll see and you'll hear that the defendant has to clean up what he has done quickly. He has 48 hours to get it cleaned up and ready to go before Gary Gooden comes to stay at the house. So what the defendant does, you'll hear that he sends a text out from the victim's phone to Gary Gooden and plants the seed of one of the many lies that he begins to tell. He tells Gary Gooden from Skip's phone that Skip, he says, hey man, when are you coming tomorrow? What's your ETA? And he tells him about what time he thinks he's gonna come. And the text that goes back to him says, I met a woman and I'm gonna go kayaking with her, so just let yourself in the house. The next day comes, but early in the morning, at 2 o'clock in the morning, Saturday morning, the 31st, the defendant is back at his apartment with a duffel bag at 2 a.m. He leaves his apartment with more golf bags, more duffel bags, plastic bags. He's very, very busy. 8:30 a.m., you'll see that the victim's Ford Escape drives into what's called Knowles Park. It's like a boat ramp. And that the defendant is the person that drives that car there. And it's dumped there, left there, to further advance the lie that Skip Scandirito went out kayaking with some woman that he met. You'll hear that around 10:30 in the morning, Gary Gooden arrives to the house, and there's no one there. And when he walks inside, everything looks clean and normal, but Skip isn't there, and neither is the defendant. Around 2-3 o'clock, the defendant comes home. This is Saturday, the night that they're supposed to be watching the Final Four together. Gary asks the defendant where his dad is. He says he doesn't know. They try to call. It goes to voicemail. But the defendant really does know where his dad is. April 1st, Easter Sunday. They have a tea time. The victim never came home. Gary Gooden is extremely concerned about his friend. His friend would not miss that tea time with him. He never came home. Mr. Gooden has a conversation with the defendant, and they decide, well, Gary decides that it's probably appropriate to start a missing persons report. They call the police. You'll hear that this is when the police investigation begins. The police are called for a missing person. The defendant tells the same story about how his dad said that he met a woman, he's going out kayaking with her, maybe something happened. So the police start looking at boat ramps, and they do find the victim's car there. That's consistent. And the defendant has the spare key to that car. You'll hear that that car was towed. You'll hear about the processing that was done on that car and what it revealed. You'll hear computer crimes experts, and they will tell you that later on that day, on that Sunday, April 1st, there's a search on the home computer of the victim who is missing at this point. And the search on that home computer is top 5 countries to flee to that don't have extradition, and that search is later deleted. This brings us to Monday, April 2nd. Skip is still missing, and the defendant's earlier deposit of $1,400 actually clears in his bank account. The following day, the police are still trying to do an investigation. They're having contact with the defendant, and they're asking him, hey, has there been any, weird transactions on the account? Let's start there. And the defendant says no, which is a lie. It's not true, because he had bought all of those cleaning supplies beforehand with his dad's credit card. The police start to get a little bit suspicious. Tuesday, April 3rd, the day before those horrific remains are found, the defendant tells the police that he's going to start making missing person flyers and that he's going to start handing them out. The police are extremely suspicious of the defendant at this point. So they decide to go back to the house and re-interview him. And they take a sworn statement from him and a sworn statement from Gary. Gary tells them all that he knows. This is the last time I talked to him. This is what happened. This is the text that I got. And the defendant talks to them as well. And one of the detectives who you'll hear from, Detective Hanley, will tell you that it's at that point that something doesn't seem right, and he asks to do a walkthrough of the house. He says, do you mind? Ask the defendant, do you mind if I just walk through the house, take a survey, make sure everything's okay? And he says, sure. So they do, and everything appears to be in order until they get to the garage. They walk into the garage, and Detective Hanley will tell you that surrounding the garage, it's like a rectangular shape, and on the edges, it's quite dirty. It hasn't been cleaned underneath some of the shelving that's there. But what strikes him is that in the center is this spotless, clean square. And he is immediately concerned. So he turns around and he says to the defendant, hey, where do you think your dad is? And he immediately responds, at the bottom of the intercoastal. It's at this point that the police decide that this is now a potential crime scene. So they kick the defendant and Gary Gooden out of that house. They tell them, stay nearby, go to a hotel, do what you got to do, but this is now potentially an active crime scene. We're going to need everything to stay. They ask Gary Gooden for his iPhone, he gives it over. They ask the defendant for his Samsung, and he fights with them about it. He doesn't want to give it to them. You'll hear about that. Eventually, they do get it from the defendant. So now, unbeknownst to the defendant, there is a covert surveillance team that you're going to hear about from the Boca Raton Police Department that begins to surveil the defendant that he does not know about. And the defendant had asked, can I have access to some of my dad's bank accounts? Do you guys mind if I do that to take care of some things because he's missing? And they say, okay. So they surveil him, and he goes to Bank of America, and he cashes or deposits a forged check for $9,500 from his dad's bank account into his own. It's a Northern Trust account. You're going to hear a lot about the defendant's financial situation leading up to this entire week and throughout the course of the trial and the course of that week. And it is important. Later on that night, the human remains canine dog Tucker is brought to the victim's car, and it positively alerts on the car, on the front, and on where the trunk is. And now the police know that this is something much more than a missing persons investigation. Their hunches appear to be coming true. You'll hear that when they do the search warrant, they're conducting that search warrant that night. They go into the garage, they find blood droplets, and those blood droplets, you'll hear about DNA, come back to the victim, Skip Scandirito. They find those blood droplets on a red dolly hand truck that is parked inside of that garage. And remember, on March 29th, the defendant had purchased one. There's also blood on the wheel, on the bar, and there are droplets inside of that garage. So what is the defendant and Gary Gooden doing during this time period where the police are actively investigating this crime? The defendant and Gary decide that they are going to go stay in a hotel, which strikes Gary as a little bit odd. You'll hear about that. You're going to hear that from Gary. It strikes him odd because the defendant lives in Fort Lauderdale, which isn't too far away from Boca Raton. So he suggests, why don't we go to Fort Lauderdale and stay at your apartment? And the defendant says no. He says, no, let's just stay a little bit more local. We'll go to the Holiday Inn over in Boca. Gary says okay, and they go. And when they get there, the defendant asks Gary to pay for the room, which he does. They go upstairs, they're together. Gary's concerned about where his friend Skip is, and the defendant tells him, I'm gonna go downstairs and I'm gonna go get a drink at the bar, but you just stay up here, it's okay. Gary doesn't think anything of it. At that point in time, he thought it was a little rude, you'll hear. The defendant doesn't go to the bar. The defendant comes downstairs, gets into his Prius, and drives to the Ocean Breeze golf course. The surveillance team is still on him. When he goes to the Ocean Breeze golf course, he's there for about 10 minutes. He gets out of his car, walks onto the golf course, walks back. He's wearing a sweatshirt. He takes it off. He puts it in his car, goes back to the Holiday Inn, goes back upstairs, tells Gary Gooden, oh, I just had a drink. You know, I'm tired. Let's go to bed. But the defendant doesn't go to bed. The defendant puts pillows in his bed to make it look like he's going to bed, so that in the morning when Gary Gooden wakes up, the defendant's not there and his car isn't there either, but there's what looks like a body in the bed. You'll hear that it's that night, in the early morning hours, that's when the defendant dumps the body, dumps pieces of it, dumps part of it. The surveillance team watches him. He drives down to Fort Lauderdale, he goes into his apartment, he changes, he comes back out, he goes back to the abandoned Ocean Breeze golf course, and his driving patterns are erratic. He walks onto the golf course with nothing. He walks off the golf course about 45 minutes later, dragging a suitcase and carrying a gas can. And you'll hear about the Eagle team that has surveillance as well, not just on the ground surveillance, but in the air. And they're able to see the defendant dragging that suitcase off of the golf course. The surveillance team is taking pictures, they follow him. The defendant puts those items in his trunk, drives to a dumpster, opens the dumpster, puts the suitcase in the dumpster, the gas can in the dumpster, some of his clothes, and a towel. You'll hear DNA evidence about the clothing, and that comes back to the defendant. But when the police take those items out of the dumpster, the first thing they notice is that smell, because it's overwhelming. And when they open the suitcase, there's a second suitcase. Inside of that are maggots, human decomposition matter, and fluid. They collect all of those items, and you'll hear that there are cuttings from inside that suitcase that come back to Skip Scandirito. So where's the defendant at this point? The defendant at this point has driven back down to Fort Lauderdale, and unfortunately, the surveillance team loses him that night. That was April 4th, the night of April 3rd going into April 4th. The police decide, obviously, at that point, they need to go do a grid search on the abandoned Ocean Breeze golf course, and that is when they make that horrific discovery. You will hear that there's a lighter that's found next to the grave of his father with his DNA on it, the defendant. You'll also hear that that same day the defendant withdraws the $1,400 that he had deposited from his dad's account, and he flees to the west coast of Florida. The police search his condo and they find an eviction notice on his door. He's $5,600 late in his rent. His Comcast bill is late. His cell phone bill has been unpaid. But the police keep tracking him, and they eventually catch up to him on the west coast of Florida. While he's there in the west coast of Florida, he transfers $7,476 from his dad's Capital One account directly into his bank account. The defendant is eventually arrested in Alachua County on April 9th, and when he is, you'll hear that there are 2 different passports found with him to Brazil, one to Brazil. He has flight time itineraries. He has a contact number for a private jet company. Throughout the course of this trial, you will hear from several expert witnesses. You're going to hear from cell phone experts, you're going to hear from computer crimes experts, and you'll hear about the messages and the calls that the defendant makes during this time period. You'll also be able to see maps of where the victim's phone and the defendant's phone are traveling to. Finally, you'll hear from Dr. Reinhard Mote. He's a medical examiner in Palm Beach County, and he will tell you that he determined the cause of death in this case to be homicide by unspecified means. And he'll explain to you how he came to that conclusion, that in almost 10,000 autopsies he has either observed or been involved in, not one of them involving dismemberment has been anything other than a homicide. Ladies and gentlemen, you will hear a lot of testimony, you'll see a lot of evidence about these events. But what I want you to focus on and what I want you to think about is that the defendant is a man who is fueled by greed. He is fueled by desire to live a lifestyle that he simply cannot afford. He is the sole beneficiary of his father's estate, and though it's not that much money, it's a lot more than what the defendant has. The defendant is an individual, James Scandirito Sr, who did everything he possibly could to get away with murder. And at the end of this case, we will ask that you find him guilty of first-degree murder and abuse of a dead human body. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Walters. On behalf of Mr. Scandirito, Ms. Ramsey, do you wish to make an opening?
I do.